Okay, so you should have the heart. Let's just go through it. We're gonna label it. I'm using blue and red, or blue and pink, so that we can tell if it's oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. So we're gonna start with blue blood, because blue blood means that it's deoxygenated. Right here, 1 and 1, and that is your vena cavas. Here and here. And this one is called your superior one, and this is called your inferior one, right? Superior means above you, and inferior means below you. So there's your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava. The blood then will arrive from the body and pool here at number 2. Number 2 is called, anyone want to help me out there? Yeah, it's the right atrium. Okay, and it's still blue blood. And then your right atrium will squeeze at the same time as the left atrium, and blood will go down into this space here. It's the third spot, which is called your right ventricle. It's going to pass through this part right here, this valve. We collectively call this one and this one that separates the atriums the atrioventricular valves. There's 2 atrioventricular valves. There's this one and this one. This one's got a really weird name. It's called the tricuspid valve. And it's because if you look at it, you'll see that it's made of 3 little leaves that close. Okay, so it looks like a BMW sign, I guess. It's when you look down the hole, it looks like that, like a peace sign. So that's why it's called a tricuspid valve. Now the ventricles, left and right, will squeeze simultaneously, and blood will go up here into this structure here. And it'll go out that way and out this way. Okay? And so this one is called what? Does anyone know what this one's called? When they go up and out. So this was called vena cava because it's going towards venous, right? Blood is going in this way, and blood is going in this way. So it's going towards venous. Here it's going away from venous. So what do we call those? Arteries or veins? Yeah. This is called an artery. And where is it going? It's going to the lungs, so we call them pulmonary. Oh, just barely fits. So this is called your left pulmonary artery, and this is called your right pulmonary. Okay, artery. So you notice how it's still blue? So it came in blue, right atrium, right ventricle, and then through to the lungs, and it's still blue. It hasn't picked up oxygen yet. So this is a rare blue artery. Okay, it's a rare blue artery. It has to pass through this valve here, and this valve here, does it even label the valve there? No, I guess it doesn't. This valve right here, we can draw an arrow if you like. That's called your pulmonary valve. Okay, your pulmonary valve. And it does its thing. It goes to the alveoli, wraps itself around each alveoli as a capillary, and then it sucks in oxygen and gives away carbon dioxide. And it returns to the heart. And now we're going to do it in, I don't have a really purely red, maybe this one. It comes back here. Oh yeah, this one works. And this one's kind of weird, but it comes back here and it joins on the back side of this. So now it's going to arrive here at number 5. So it went to the lungs and it's coming back now. And from the left-hand side, it comes from in here, and then from the right-hand side, it comes in from here. Now, are these blood vessels going to venous or going away from venous? Going to the heart or away from the heart? Yeah, so we're going to call them veins. And so it's a vein. And guess what? It's just called a left pulmonary vein. And this one over here would be called the right pulmonary vein. And again, a very rare vein that's red this time. Okay? So now this space here called the left atrium will fill up with blood. And that's why you need that little fraction of a time where your heart's in dystole, where it's not squeezing, so that it can actually fill it with blood. And then 5 and 2 will squeeze simultaneously, and blood will go down into here, into region 6. And region 6 is got the same name as the adjacent side, except it's called the left ventricle rather than the right ventricle. It's passing through this one. In this one, it's also called an atrial ventricular valve, but this one's got the name mitral valve or mitral valve. Okay, I don't know what you want to call it. Mitral, mitral, tomato, tomato. Forgot to put valve there. Okay. And then now your right ventricle, and remember this one's super duper thick because it's got to push the blood the furthest, right, to your head, to your guts, to your toes, all the way. So it's going to squeeze really hard, and it's going to go into this giant blood vessel called the aorta. And the aorta will branch off. So our arteries will go to your head, to your arms, right? So it'll branch off to make your carotid arteries. And it'll branch off to make your brachial arteries. And it'll branch off to make all those other arteries that feed your lower limbs and your guts and your other organs as well. Now it's got to pass through this. Again, we don't label it very well. This one right here. And so that valve is called your aortic valve. Okay, and that kind of makes sense. So you got your aortic valve there, and you got your pulmonary valve right there. Okay, that I didn't label very well. Sorry, it got a little messy, but that's it. This bottom part, it's kind of nonsensical because it's actually called the apex of the heart. And we usually think apex is the top, right? But this one's the tip of the bottom of the heart. It's like the tip of the iceberg underneath the water, you know? But that's the apex. And look, that's the yummy part that we would eat if you're looking for a nice hot pot ingredient. Some beef heart, chicken heart. Okay? So hopefully you could track that. I didn't number this one. The aorta would be number 7. Okay? So just remember there are 2 lungs there, and that's where you get your oxygen from. Okay? So this is what the pulmonary valve, the tricuspid looks like that. The mitral valve, the mitral valve or mitral valve, it just looks like this. If you to look at it, it just looks like, you know, a circle that's been cut in half. So there's the mitral valve, and there's a tricuspid valve. I believe this is called the bicuspid valve too. It's got lots of names. The atrioventriculars, the bicuspid valve, the mitral valve, the tricuspid valve. There's so many names. It's like, feel free to make up your own names, in fact, it sounds like, right? Okay. So that's the heart anatomy. I hope you were able to follow along. Everyone likes doing the heart anatomy because, you know, they're so fond of their heart. Let's take a look at our lesson here. Our lesson isn't very long. We just have to finish up this one little section on vasculature. So vasculature is all the structures that take blood for internal gas exchange, right? And nutrient exchange. Now, last day, we just talked about, we were here, I believe, and we just finished talking about how your heart beats. Top beats, bottom beats, rest. Top bottom, rest, right? We call the squeezing of your heart systole, squeeze, S, systole, and diastole is that little break in between to let the atria fill up with blood. And we went on to talk about the heart sounds. The lub-dubs is actually the valves, the atrial and ventriculars, and the pulmonary and the aortic valves shutting, slamming shut. You're listening to slamming doors when you listen to your heart. Slam, 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 right? So that's pretty neat. And this is the systole and diastole steps. So the aorta is squeeze, and then the ventricle is squeeze, and then there's a rest break, right? And we talked about how the heart has its own intrinsic control because it's got these two nervous tissues that are uniquely found right inside the heart itself that makes it fire every 0.85 seconds or so. And you see those movies where someone reaches into the heart, the chest of someone, and pulls out their heart, and they're holding it, or you see a heart on the ground for a split second because it somehow decided to leave the corpse of the body of the corpse for some reason, and it's still beating. And that's because as long as the muscle, the cardiac muscle, has nutrients and oxygen, right? As long as the cells are still alive, it will still beat until it runs out of oxygen and carbohydrates and ATP and stuff like that, until the tissue actually starts dying. So technically, the heart could be ripped out of the heart, and as long as it's adequately perfused with oxygen and the cells are still alive, it could beat for a while. And it's caused by these unique sections of nervous tissue called the SA node, way up here in the right atrium. And then here, just at the boundary of the right atrium and the right ventricle, is the AV node. So this will fire, and it sends a signal to the top part to squeeze, the atria, squeeze. And then the signal reaches the AV node, which sends a big electrical impulse around the whole bottom of the heart, which is the the cardiac muscle, and it'll cause the ventricles to squeeze. And then it stalls out for a little bit of time. Okay? And it's usually roughly around 0.85 seconds. And then we talked about how you have extrinsic control, right? Your medulla oblongata, it has this control because it has these chemoreceptors as well as the carotid bodies that detect, like, if your pH is out of whack, if your CO2 level is out of whack, and your O2 level is out of whack, and it'll increase your heart rate in concert with your breathing rate, right? Which you guys probably looked at in preparation for today's test. So the sympathetic autonomic nervous system is, the way I remember this is it's sympathetic to you maybe dying, so it helps you try to survive a fight or flight episode. So like a bear comes to eat you, and you're like, I don't want to get eaten. So your heart is sympathetic to this, and it kicks in by going more active, right? Well, your parasympathetic would be the opposite. It's the chill out part of your autonomic nervous system. Now this, we can actually, because your heart has its own nervous impulse and everything else, right? When you looked at your nervous system and all of the movement and all that stuff, it's electricity. It's not the type of electricity that we expect because we're used to the stuff that comes out of your walls, which is electrons moving. This is ions moving, right? Sodium and potassium moving around. So when you have moving charges, you have electricity. And the nervous impulses in your heart can actually be detected with electrodes, with probes. And I don't know, has anyone had this done when they've gone into the hospital and they've got the little stickers and they stick them on your chest to see how things are going? You often get them done when you go into emergency and they're worried about, maybe it's an internal issue. Sometimes you get it done when you go for surgery, right? Because they'll plug you into a machine to watch your heart the whole time. So they're just little stickers, and it just measures the electrical output of your heart. And typically you get this PQRST wave. PQRST wave. We're not going to spend too much time on this. We usually analyze this a little bit more. But this is called an EKG. Some people call it EKG. I don't know which one sounds better, but in the movies they all call them EKGs. But that's German for heart, cardio. We use the letter C. Anyways, there's a whole bunch of things we can tell from this, right? If you're an emergency, I've seen the emergency doctor come in, take a look at the ECG. I've seen the cardiologist come and take a look at the EKG, and they can tell quite a bit. See these squares? Those are intervals of time. So they can see if this thing is compressed or if it's been elongated, stretched, and then they can tell by just looking, right? We would have to count the squares, but they can look because they're so used to it, to tell if your heart is beating too quickly or too slowly. So if they see a whole bunch of these PQRSTs all jammed together, that's called tachycardia. Tachycardia is usually when your heart beats more than 100 beats per minute. So if your heart is racing, it's called tachycardic. And they can also look at this and see if it's been spread out. So the term for slow is bradycardia. So you could be bradycardic. And that is usually under 60 beats per minute. Okay, so resting heart rate. So when you sit here right now and you check your heart rate, it could be 0 if you really didn't want to be here. But if you're just sitting here chilling out, it's probably around 60, 65, sometimes approaching 70. If you're below that, you're bradycardic. Now, you got to be careful because some fit people actually have resting heart rates in the high 30s, low 40s sometimes, like soccer players. And that's because their heart muscle is so strong that every pump pumps the blood around enough compared to our 2 or 3 pumps because we're not so fit. Okay? Now we can look at this thing and look at these P, the QRS, and the T waves, and we can look at the length of these individually. We can look at the whole thing, or we can look for just the landmarks themselves. So the P wave occurs just prior to atrial contraction, just before the top squeezes, the electrical impulse comes to tell it to squeeze. And then the QRS usually happens just before the the ventricles contract. And then you get this little T after they finish contracting, and then they're resetting kind of deal. If you have something wrong with your atria not contracting, you might see this thing flatter or not even there. Okay? Or you might be missing some of this R or the S or sometimes the T. So a good indicator that your atria is not working is if something's wrong with this P, and your heart, your top of your heart could be just doing this. It's called atrial fibrillation, which is not contracting in a nice concerted way. So it's just kind of randomly squeezing. That's atrial fibrillation. You can have ventricular fibrillation. It's way more pronounced. The outcome. If the bottom's not squeezing very well, you're probably in some kind of arrest, cardiac arrest. And that's where they have to shock your heart back into a regular rhythm. Okay. So usually, in the movies when everyone goes, you got to shock them because they're dying, it's not usually because they're flatline. It's usually because the top is doing something weird or the bottom is doing something weird and it's not squeezing in concert. And the electricity actually shocks it back into a normal rhythm, right? If you're flatline, you're in big trouble. So we just wanted to take a look at the vascular pathways. So the vascular pathways is where gas exchange happens, okay? And you have two. You have the pulmonary circuit where it goes to the lungs to get oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide. And then you have your systemic pathways where it gets oxygen to your brain, to your guts, to your liver, to all your organs and all your skin and all your muscles, and it gets rid of the carbon dioxide. Okay, so you have two circuits. Now the first circuit, the pulmonary circuit, it comes out of here, goes to your lungs and comes back. That's the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit leaves the aorta, right here, and then goes to all the different parts of your body. So you have many, many capillary beds after that. Okay, and that's called your systemic circuit. In both cases, there's gas exchange. Here, the gas exchange is at the capillary beds of the alveoli, and it goes from blue blood to red blood, oxygenated. And in the systemic system, it's the opposite. You go to the capillary beds and you go from red blood to blue blood because you give away your oxygen and you pick up your carbon dioxide. Now, a couple of them, here's a couple of them. The first one here is where all the food from your guts absorb all those nutrients in those capillary beds. And the first place they go is up to your liver to be filtered. Another one here is where the blood from your aorta, which is leaving your heart, the very first place that fresh blood goes to serve any organ is the heart itself. And those are the coronary arteries. And they actually plug in directly into the aorta, which is the fresh blood being circulated around your body. Now, we talked a little bit about blood pressure. Blood pressure is the pressure created in your blood vessels from your heart beating. Now, your blood vessels, like your aorta and stuff, are kind of like a balloon. They're inflated. But the heart comes along and squeezes that balloon, and then everything's under more pressure, and then it relaxes. So it goes into systole and then diastole. So if you squeeze a balloon, that's systole. You let it go, it's diastole. But there's still pressure in the balloon. The usual measure is 120/80 for systole and diastole. And if it's above that, you're hypertensive, and you're below that, you're hypotensive. Okay? Some of us, as you get older, so we're just going to finish it off. It's just one more picture. If you're hypertensive, you'll know, right? Your doctors will put you on medication, or they'll ask you to change your diet. Low blood pressure can be a problem too, right? Some of you guys, you may experience this. Girls usually have lower blood pressure than men. And if you stand up really quickly and you get lightheaded, that's an indicator that you might be low blood pressure, okay? Or you might be anemic. So this is the one I just wanted to show you before you leave. And this is a cross-section of the blood vessels, starting from this would be the aorta, subdividing into arteries, into arterioles, and then blood capillaries, and then back to venules, veins, and then your vena cava. And then down here, it takes a look at what the blood pressure is as it moves from those big vessels to the small vessels back to the big vessels. And it looks at the speed of the blood, and it looks at the cross-sectional area of the blood vessels. Okay? So if you just give me a minute, we'll talk about how this works, and then it'll be all done. The blood pressure. Through here, this blood is moved by your squeezing heart. So every time your heart squeezes, look how the pressure goes up. And when it goes into diastole, it goes down. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. And as the blood moves, the pressure drops off. Okay? Why does it drop off? It's because it's all going down one tube, and then all of a sudden it starts splitting off into more and more tubes. It's kind of like a freeway, and then it turning off into 2 highways, into 4 highways, and then into city streets. There's less cars going down there. So there's less pressure on the cars to move. Also, because there's less pressure for the cars to move, they can actually slow down. Okay? And this is ideal because you want these guys to slow down and go through the blood vessels, the capillaries, one at a time, to give away oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. Right? Pick up hydrogen, pick up metabolic waste. And then when it comes out of the capillary bed, you can see that the velocity, here's the velocity, it picks up a little bit again, but now it's not being driven by the heart. What's it being driven by now? Muscle contraction and valve inversion. Pressure also drops, and it's not driven by the heart anymore, so the blood pressure drops in your blood vessels quite a bit. So that's why when you cut yourself, if it's an artery, it'll spurt. If it's a vein, it'll just weep. Okay, because there's no pulsing pressure to keep it flowing. The last thing we have to really look at, which gets some complicated for some kids, is the cross-sectional area. So this is your large aorta. It's just one tube. And then over here is your vena cava, one tube. But as those tubes divide, you get millions, probably millions, I'll use millions of little tubes that only fit one red blood cell at a time. So the amount of roads that are available are plentiful. And you remember we told you this. If you took all the blood vessels out of your body and you lined them up end to end, it'd be 161 kilometers, 161,000 kilometers. And what is the majority of those blood vessels? Capillaries. Okay? So it's like one major highway dividing into 2 major highways, and then into like dozens of streets, and into hundreds or thousands of city neighborhood streets. right? So you have way more roads for these guys to travel and slow down, give away their oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and pick up metabolic waste. And then, as they come out of the capillary beds, those roads start joining up again, and then the cross-sectional area starts to diminish again into that one superior and inferior vena cava. Okay? So the three things you have to take away from this is what happens to blood pressure as you move away from the heart, getting to the capillary beds, and then moving back to the heart. What happens to blood speed when it leaves the heart, entering the blood capillaries, and then leaving the blood capillaries, going back to the heart. And what happens to the cross-sectional area, the available tubes, as you move away from the heart, getting into your capillary beds, and then coming out of your capillary beds. All right? And the last picture is just showing you how blood moves through veins again. Right? Muscle contraction, blood goes up, it can't fall back down. Okay? Because the valve's shut. They only allow one-way flow of blood. So these pictures and this slideshow are up, and the video will be posted. So if you need to review